and this is all about observing play and linking it to learning. So I'm your host today, Ana Ardelean. If you haven't seen me before, I'm based in England, in the very north of England. I'm a play worker by nature. I have worked with children of all ages. I've trained in play work. I've taught play work. I've worked in preschools, including in a few different countries. So at the moment, I work with elementary schools to improve the quality of their play, as well as running these sessions with all of you lovely people. So thank you for joining us today. This is what we'll cover in this session. So we will look at observation types and elements of observations and what makes a good observation for play. We'll actually have a go at observing play because that's, as I was saying earlier, we can talk about it all day long, but actually it's about developing the skills to be able to do it and then interpret it and come together and discuss it. And we'll link that to your preschool cycle program areas in terms of learning and development. So quite an interactive session. This is what we're aiming for today. So enhancing your play observation skills. We'll also touch on play response skills, and we'll do that through a couple of scenarios because I think this is really important. A lot of the time we tend to focus on play and observing play, but we still need to observe ourselves in order to get a full picture of what's happening. And then, of course, drawing links between play and children's learning under your development areas. Before we start, just very quickly, I'd like to mention that I'm recruiting some research participants for 2 focus groups that I'm planning. So I'd like to evaluate people's learning and the impact of these sessions, as well as identify any areas for further development of your practice. So for the first focus group, which I plan in for January, I would need participants who have attended the first 3 sessions. So the first one, child development, second one on play and today. And then for the second one, I'll need people who have attended the first 3 and at least two more after that, so that we can do a really good evaluation of what's come out of these sessions. They'll be very informal. There'll be opportunities to chat more about play and education and share learning, and reflect on practice as well as these webinars. So the length of them will depend on the size of the group. I'm aiming for 4 or 5 people, ideally, but it could be less, but they shouldn't last longer than an hour each. So if you're interested in taking part in that, please send a join email to Chris and myself, and that's why I've put the email addresses on screen, and let us know. So then I can send you an information sheet and a consent form as well, so that we do things properly. And your contribution is totally voluntary. If you want to withdraw at any point, you're very welcome to, but it will be extremely helpful and very much appreciated. And it will serve as a platform for improving things in the future as well. So that's my spiel. So I'm recruiting as well, but this is totally voluntary. Okay, right. So observing play. I think everybody who understands the value of play, particularly in early education, recognize that observing children at play is one of the most, if not the most important aspect of the job of a teacher. It's a central part of the preschool cycle program and assessing learning. And it's been a central part of the equivalent of that program in the UK, which is the early years foundation stage, which has been around since 2008. But I don't think we can discuss observation without acknowledging that it is inextricably linked to planning. Whether we plan adult activities or we plan the environment for lots of free play, and then we observe what happens and we link that to learning, or we plan for individual children or small groups or for the whole classroom, or whether we just observe first and then we use that in order to plan. Good early years education practice tells us that we should have a learning plan with learning goals, and have those for each individual child based on their likes and their interests, and then add observations that show the learning journey and progress in all development areas, as well as next steps. And those next steps are really crucial, and that's part of how you interpret those observations, but we'll come on to that a bit later. However, we can have learning goals for certain areas of the classroom as well, and use those to see which children access them and achieve them. So we've got a prolific author here, so Gronlund, who I've put on the list of useful resources as well. She's written a few different books. I think 2 of them are really good, and I've suggested them in one of the handouts that you'll have available after the session. But there's another resource that I've put in the shared drive, by the same author, and that's really useful as well. But Gay Gronlund, really good early years educator, consultant, writer. So she places an emphasis on planning for play and learning through organizing the classroom environment and thinking about each area of the classroom and identify learning goals related to what the children do in each area. She focuses specifically on block construction, so on the block or construction area, and that's to offer an example of how such a simple resource, free play, can have multiple learning goals, most of which here fall under the cognitive development area. So shape identification, measuring, sorting, categorizing, counting, understanding properties of gravity, momentum, and obviously social development, communicating with others while they're building and completing a structure, and creativity as well, in terms of making new things with the blocks. So this is a really quite a useful way of thinking about planning and linking that to observation, using observations to then help you plan, and so on, and the cycle continues. So given the link between observation and planning, before we delve any deeper into observing play, I'd just like to open up these questions to the room, and people can type in the chat if they want, or if we've got a couple of people who want to unmute themselves, that would be great. I just thought it'd be interesting and really valuable to see what your approach to planning is in the classroom, and if you already incorporate observations of play into your planning, and if you do that, how are you doing it, and how are you finding it as well? So the floor is yours for the next couple of minutes. If you want it. I'll keep an eye on the chat. Let's see, have we got any brave people who do want to unmute themselves? Hey, so center set up where I observe their play. Lana, thank you for that. What, can I just unpick that? What do you mean by centers? So is that areas or an actual place in the classroom where you go and look at play from? Ah, Sheila, okay, so you find this a bit challenging.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sheila.
Hi, hello.
I've been waiting for this session because it's been a while since I've been in kindergarten and I'm back in it. And one of my challenges is planning and finding time for observation during playtime. So I'm really looking forward to different strategies that you have to offer.
Okay. Timing is always going to be an issue, and I think good observations, or any observations for that matter, although some of the different types of observations that we'll look at today do tend to take a bit more time, but there are certain techniques that you can use that would only take a couple of minutes and that's that. It shouldn't really take that long. It should be there to help you, not hinder you. But yeah, I know it's really difficult to find the time to observe. So thank you for that. Every day I'm going in centers and okay. My places where they can play with certain things that I share with them. Okay. General unit ideas. Students became interested during play in certain topics. I allow that to be the next step of play. Lovely. Read items, a nutrition unit in our class. Lovely. So you're allowing your observations to inform your planning, which is really, really good. That's great. That's really good practice. Okay. If anybody else wants to share things, then pop them in the chat. I will have a look at them. But if not, then we'll move on. But I think this is useful because different people will have different approaches, and I think the main thing to take away from today is that there isn't a right way or a wrong way of doing observations. There are suggestions and there's good practice, but I think how you go about observing play is very much an individual choice, and it's based on your personality, on your experience of observing play, and also on what you're trying to achieve with it. There are certainly different ways in which you can focus your observations. I do find the most insightful to be focusing in on specific children, so either one or a small group. But you can focus on an area of learning or an area of development, and you can also focus on a specific skill or a benchmark. And like Gronlund suggested, you can focus on an area of the classroom or a specific activity, and then observe what happens to children as part of that. There's no one way is better than the other, is what you prefer, but I think a combination of this would be really good and would probably be the most holistic way of doing it. And just like there are different focuses for observations, there are different types of them as well. The preschool cycle program asks you to make observations, but it doesn't quite specify the type or the frequency, as far as I'm aware, and correct me if I'm wrong. But what that means is that you've got quite a bit of freedom. You can choose any observational types to suit your purposes. So I thought it'd be quite useful to look at different techniques that you may be able to carry out in your classrooms, depending on what you feel most drawn to and also how much time you've got. So the first one is magic moments. And this is one of the most brief observations you can make. They're usually captured on Post-it notes or sticky labels, and they can be easily put in a learning journey or a file for each individual child. This is probably the quickest way to note and record observations, and usually the most convenient one for people as well, because it's quick. And you can often carry a pack of Post-it notes in your and a pen in your pocket, and take it out and jot a few things down as you're interacting with children, and then put it away for later. So this is quite a useful one. It doesn't really allow you to capture too much detail, but it also, on the plus side, it's about using it to capture anything that is a first for children. So first time showing emotional resilience, first time developing their fine motor skills, whatever it might be, that's really useful. Or something that is particular to a child, a fascination with a particular resource, maybe trains, maybe cars, maybe dolls. So it's about noting what's unusual or exceptional about children's play at that moment in time. And the aim of this type of observation is to build a bit of a picture about children's interests and development, from lots of different pieces of information. And then I do find this to be quite nice. Oh, we've got something in the chat. We've got a suggestion. So an app. Yes, apps are quite good. Yeah, it's only in recent years that we've started to use apps for recording observations, or like you say here, take a picture and record the children during play. Yeah, definitely. It is very helpful. Thank you for that. I don't know what, obviously here in the UK, most settings require practitioners to have their phones and their devices away. So you need a device that's specific to the setting and have that all set up. And I think people here are fairly old school still with pens and paper, and I'm probably one of them. But yeah, I know how useful these the technology can be nowadays. Another type of observation is narrative. And I think this is probably the one that we're most familiar with. So it's quite long written accounts, narrative accounts, recording details, such as the language used by a child, what they might be playing, or who they might be playing with, levels of involvement and concentration. It might have a picture included as well. And these are usually quite, we get stuck into their play. So we might observe children for 20, 30 minutes at a time. So this is a type of observation that doesn't tend to happen very often. We might do it once a term for a child. But there's a lot of richness of detail that can come out of that, and it can really tell us a lot about the children. But yeah, it takes a little bit longer. Learning stories, these take even longer. They're done over a longer period of time. But I find these to be extremely useful because they show a story that's then shared with the child and shared with the parents as well, and the parents can contribute to it. So it's quite an inclusive way of doing observations with children. So the purpose is to record an specific episode of play and learning, again based on the child's interests, the level of involvement, persistence, communication, taking responsibility. So very, very useful details that paint a very good picture of a child. And the difference between this and the rest of the observation techniques is that this is written as a story in first person. So it's as if we are talking to the child and we're explaining to them what we're observing. We look at each step, we explain it, it includes a reflection at the end. There are photographs attached to this, and it can be shared with children for their own feedback. And it's usually something that children look forward to because they know you're sharing a story with them about their own learning. So that can help children reflect on their learning, and it's really, really nice. And at the end, we include the parents as well. So we share with them and we get their opinions, and also what they find useful in terms of what happens at home. What can we feed into the story that we recognize as learning at home? I've put an example in there because I think this is probably one that needs the example, so you can kind of see it and take it in. So there is a template there, and that's looking at a group of children, and which I find even more interesting, but that can take even longer because you might not share it with the children until a few days later, and so it can be a bit of work, but it's extremely good for children who might be starting out and might find it a bit difficult to adjust, or also for boosting self-esteem, because if we tell children that we've written a story about how well they've played or they've done some learning, that really helps with their self-confidence and their self-efficacy as well, which is great for us to be developing at this point in time. Time samples. These are fairly easy, can be quite quick depending on the amount of time that you spend, but they're observations that are made every few minutes over a set period of time. So they include what the child is engaged in, what area they're in, the level of involvement. The thing with this is that you need to be able to make the observations regularly, which sometimes can be a challenge when you've got lots of different children, when you've got a free flow environment, so they go in and out. So it's at some point you're going to have to follow them. But each observation should take less than a minute to record. And these are useful. These are really, really useful if you are trying to see how much a child is spending in different areas or with different resources, and also the level of interest in different types of activities. So if you note that within an hour a child is spending 5 minutes at the arts and crafts area, 1 minute in construction, 2 minutes in another area, then you're starting to get a feel for their interests, and it's quite useful, especially when you don't know children quite well. I think this is quite a good one, but it very much depends on what you're drawn to. Another way of recording observations is tracking, and this is about tracking children throughout your classroom and your setting. So if it's just a classroom and one outdoor area, then you don't necessarily need a floor plan. If it's a big setting where children have access to lots of different classrooms, then you wouldn't need a floor plan. But it does include the outdoors, and it's about observing and noting. Observing and noting the areas that children visit, how long they were at each activity, and the whether or not the children seem to jump from one activity to another. I think this is really useful, especially if you're thinking children struggle with levels of concentration. And I remember observing a little boy who just seemed to go from one thing to another, and we couldn't settle, and we just couldn't find something that really, really interested them. And actually it turned out that he was just moving around with his toys. He had a different toy, and he was just moving them around in different rooms. And I thought, wow, that is really interesting. That's a transportation schema, which a lot of children will have. So when they're moving around, they might actually have something in their hands that they put down, pick up something else, and move it. So that type of observation can tell you a lot about whether or not children have issues with levels of concentration, or if they're just exploring or playing out their schemas. So that's tracking. You can also use tracking in terms of figuring out which areas are most used. So you don't always have to look at children and track children. You can track different areas in your classroom and see, are children spending time in them? Is it the same children all the time, or is it different children who are accessing all the different areas? So you can do it like that as well. And that will give you a good idea of how well areas are accessed, and also who is accessing them. Is there equality of opportunity in terms of which children use areas? A sixth method is a sociogram, and this is about recording social development. So we're again focusing in on a specific child, and observing them, what they're playing with, and most importantly, who they're playing with. We're noting whether or not they play with different children, whether they change activities with the same children, or they go to different activities and they find it easy to engage with the children. So noting very much and focusing very much on social interactions. And again, this is really useful because we might think that children don't really have that many friends, and they tend to jump from one area to another, and they don't tend to talk to anybody. But on closer inspection, you can see that maybe children have a large group of friends, but only spend time briefly with each of them in different areas. And that's great. That's still really good social development, even though it might not be as we imagined it, the same group of friends hanging out, playing in different ways. So this is I would say it's quite a good and powerful way of observing children's development and tracking that, and also have a note of their social groups and social competence as well. So I quite like this, and I'm drawn to social development, so I find this quite an easy one to do. So again, it's very much about what you're drawn to and your own personality and interest in terms of selecting methods. Last but not least, there's the Reggio Emilia approach. And I think this takes a little bit of getting used to and a little bit more time to build up to. The Reggio Emilia approach obviously it's a education method in its own right, but they do have a very specific way of observing children, and they work from the understanding that researching children, researching the world, is the best way of capturing information about children. So they look at children as researchers. They also don't tend to look at children individually, so they look at them as members of learning groups that are building a collective body of knowledge. So what you'll often see is large sheets of paper with different names for different children, and capturing conversations, dialogue, interactions, working together, and ways of working together. So listening is a huge part of this type of observation, and recording interactions between separate children and numbering those contributions and interactions is something that you'll often see. Aided by photos, videos, any artifacts, objects. It's quite, I would say, it can be a little bit more time consuming, and it does require a bit more attention and focusing in on a group of children, but it places the emphasis on listening, really, really listening, not just looking and taking it in and interpreting, really listening. And I think this it's really important, and that's why it's featured in here, just for your information. But I do think this takes a bit of work. But if you ever have the time and fancy having a go at this, then it's there, and I know you know about it. Whatever type of observation you do, whatever you choose to go for, there will always be elements to consider, elements that are general, and that we should take into account, and that make up a really good observation. And first and foremost, it's about being factual, being objective, factual, specific, and focusing on what you're seeing. Leaving reflection and interpretation for after. That's extremely important. So writing in present tense in order to collect evidence and assess it later, not at the time of writing. I think that's quite difficult for us as adults because we want to create meaning. We love to create meaning and interpret things, and actually a good observation is just taking in what's happening at face value, describing it first, and then trying to work out what's actually happening. Whatever type of observation and whoever or whatever area you're observing, it needs a recording of the date and the time so that you can track children's progression. And I think that's, that goes without saying, but sometimes we can forget, especially if we do magic moments quickly on Post-its. I've forgotten before to do that. But a date and the time is really useful. Not doing observations, not treating observations as checklists. So focusing on the outcome rather than the process. It's not about that. It's about the exact opposite. It's looking at what's happening without linking it to different areas of development, which is very tempting because you might be seeing something and you might think, oh, this is a really good way of linking it to the motor development. So I'm going to observe this and I'm going to write this up. But that's going about it in a different way than we would expect you to. So observing what's happening, capturing what's happening, and then looking at the whys and the hows is really what observation is about. Capturing the child's voice, it really is important. And that might be writing what they say, writing what children say verbatim, or describing clearly how they're making their wishes known or what they're doing. It's really important that we capture their voice because we're doing it for the children. And we're doing it because we want it to be meaningful to their journey, to their learning journey. So including any pictures, examples of their work are another great way of making sure that we're focusing on the children's voices. So that's during the observation. But obviously a good observation doesn't stop there. So after that, it is about interpreting your results and looking at patterns, especially if you've done previous observations of the same child or the same area, identifying patterns or comparing them. And most importantly, I would say, and the last step of every good reflection and observation is thinking about next steps. You know, based on this observation, what am I going to do? Just like Lydia was saying, so if children, you notice children becoming interested in something during their play, you might plan next steps. Okay, we might include this in the curriculum in our class. So that's really important. Whether it's next steps for individual children, so targeted individualized plans, or next steps and changes to the curriculum, it's really, really different. I think something that's not necessarily included there, but really important, is focusing on what children can do. A lot of the time we tend to focus on what children can't do, and it's really important that we observe what they can do and then work on building on those skills. I think that's essential. Some things to consider when you're starting to observe children. Now, I'm not going to go through everything, because they're here, you can come back to them and you can reflect on these things in your own time. But I am going to pick up on that last question, which is, are your observations positive, unbiased, objective, non-judgmental? And this is all about the language that is used during observations and capturing them. And the goal is to use descriptive language. So trying not to make judgments or interpret what you're seeing in first instance. And this is a good example coming from Mary Fawcett, who's written a great book, and that's Learning Through Child Observation. And it's one of the resources I've suggested in the handout. This is the second edition, and she's written a third edition in since then, and I think that's a bit more useful. But this is a good way of thinking about it. So what's descriptive, what's judgmental, what's interpretive? Stick with descriptive, stick with what you're seeing, and then interpret at the end. But judgment should really stay out of it. We don't really know if we can't really say children like something based on us noticing that they've played with it once or twice. So we shouldn't really be using language like, oh, they like this, because we're not too sure. If we've asked them and they said, oh, I like this, then we can record that. Same with children's feelings. If they're throwing bricks on the table, that doesn't necessarily mean they're angry. They might just like the sound of it. So I think that's one of the most difficult things, to keep judgment and interpretation out of the observation and leave it for later. This could help. I found this useful in terms of words and phrases to avoid and what's better to use. So being as specific as possible. The child is spending 5 minutes painting instead of they're spending a long time or they're spending a short time, because that's not specific, and it's also making a judgment, because for a child of 5 minutes could be a long time or it could be a short time. We don't quite know. So recording the exact time is really useful. It seems like, it appears, again, that's making our own judgment. So that's why we focus on what's been said, what's been done, being very factual and objective. And if you are observing a pattern, definitely write about that. But it's trying to stay away from making judgments like, oh, they like that because they've been doing it 3 or 5 times. We don't know that. They might actually hate it, but they feel like they can't do it, so they keep coming back to it so they can master it. We don't know unless we ask children. And sometimes it's best not to ask them, especially if they're engrossed in something. If they're looking for help, if they're sharing things, then that's different. But sometimes it's about sitting back, just observing. And if children do need scaffolding, then they do. But a lot of the time they can do things independently, and that's the best way of learning. I thought this, you might already know this, but I figured it's a good practical suggestion. So observing free child-led play, I would say, is best for gaining insight into children's interests and using that to plan the curriculum or any individualized learning journeys. However, we can observe playful learning by setting up some play without necessarily being involved. And that's through the use of play invitations. And what this means is setting up some materials or some props in an area, and then looking at how children interact with those resources and with each other. And this can really help you focus your observation. Play invitations is a concept derived from the Reggio Amelia approach, which is all about non-directive exploration. And I've popped a link in there because I've seen quite a few. I think that's a really good one because it collates examples from different educators and what they've done with lots of pictures and some explanation around what invitations to play should achieve. So that could be something if you, especially if you're struggling a little bit with making time to observe children, you can set something up and really dedicate your time to observe children in that area, especially if lots of children go to that. And the chances are, and from experience, children do go to that because it's something new. Curiosity, what's this? What can we make with this? So there's a lot of really nice play that can come out of play invitations that are adult initiated, but not led. So that can give you a bit of time to make observations. More involvement, medial to complex involvement, and that's to reference last month's play intervention hierarchy. But another useful way of assessing learning and helping planning can be question of the day, and maybe some of you are already doing this, but having random questions or questions that link to different themes that you might be looking at that particular day or week or month can be really useful and can be part of maybe coming in and settling in routine. Have you flown a kite? Can you do gymnastics? Do you brush your teeth before bed? Would you let a frog sleep on your pillow? It could be as mundane or as wild and creative and imaginative as possible. But this will spark conversation amongst children, and you can use responses to assess both learning and individual skills. And you can also observe their conversations around it, which is absolutely brilliant and quite fun a lot of the time. So again, another way to feed into planning at the same time as giving you something to observe. There's lots to observe anyway, but sometimes having a bit of structure can help people. Okay,